The apartment building had seen better days. Its walls bore the wear of decades, with peeling wallpaper and creaky floorboards that groaned underfoot. But for Jacob, fresh out of college and strapped for cash, it was a start. The rent was cheap, the location decent, and his new home seemed quiet. Too quiet. Jacob's first few nights were uneventful. The usual city sounds seeped through the thin windows: distant sirens, occasional shouting, and the hum of passing cars. Yet, something felt off. His next-door neighbor never seemed to leave their apartment. Not once did Jacob hear a door open or close. Instead, at night, faint noises crept through the adjoining wall, scraping, whispers, and what sounded like sobbing. He dismissed it as the quirks of an old building and tired tenants. That is, until the peephole incident. It happened late one night, just as Jacob was settling into bed. He heard a faint creak outside his door, followed by a soft shuffling sound. Curious, he crept to the door and peered through the peephole. His heart skipped a beat. A face stared back. It was pale, with sunken eyes and an expression that seemed devoid of life. The person didn't move or blink, just stood there, unyielding. Jacob stumbled backward, his heart racing. Gathering his courage, he swung the door open. The hallway was empty. The next morning, Jacob convinced himself it had been a trick of his overactive imagination. But as the days turned into weeks, the noises from the neighbor's apartment grew more unsettling. The scraping became louder, the whispers more distinct, though never quite intelligible. And the sobbing, it sounded closer, as though someone was right on the other side of the wall, crying into the plaster. Jacob tried knocking on the neighbor's door one day, hoping to introduce himself and maybe ease his nerves. No answer. He tried again, louder this time, but the only response was silence. That night, as he lay awake, the noises returned. This time, however, there was a new sound, a faint tapping, as if fingernails were drumming against the shared wall. Fed up, Jacob decided to confront his neighbor directly. He marched to their door, flashlight in hand, and knocked once more. When no one answered, he twisted the knob. To his surprise, it turned easily, the door creaking open to reveal darkness. "Hello?" he called, his voice echoing in the empty space. The flashlight beam swept across the room. The apartment was devoid of furniture, its walls bare except for long, jagged scratch marks gouged deep into the plaster. A pungent smell of mildew and decay lingered in the air. On the floor, Jacob noticed something odd. Small, circular holes, almost as if someone had drilled into the wood repeatedly. As he stepped further inside, the door slammed shut behind him. Jacob spun around, his flashlight flickering. Panic surged as he tried the door, but it wouldn't budge. Then he heard it, the scraping sound. It was louder now, coming from everywhere at once, surrounding him. "Who's there?" Jacob shouted, his voice trembling. The whispers began, a chorus of overlapping voices murmuring unintelligibly, growing louder and more frantic. He backed away from the door, the beam of his flashlight darting wildly. In the corner of the room, he saw movement. A figure, hunched and emaciated, emerged from the shadows, its head tilted unnaturally, its hollow eyes fixating on him. "You shouldn't have come here," it whispered, its voice raspy and disjointed. Jacob bolted for the door, pounding on it with all his strength. The figure didn't follow, but merely stood there, watching, as if amused. Finally, the door gave way and Jacob stumbled into the hallway, gasping for air. He slammed it shut behind him, his hands shaking. The next morning, Jacob packed his belongings and left the apartment. He didn't care about breaking his lease or losing his deposit. He just wanted to be far away. As he drove off, he glanced back at the building one last time. In the window of his neighbor's apartment, the pale face stared down at him, unmoving. Years later, when Jacob recounted the story, he learned something chilling. The apartment he had fled from hadn't been rented out in over a decade. The last tenant, a recluse, had been found dead inside, his fingernails worn down to the bone. No one knew why he had scratched at the walls or what he had been trying to escape from. Jacob did his best not to think about it. But sometimes late at night, he still heard the faint sound of scratching, an echo of the neighbor he'd never forget. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, a labyrinth of towering pines and tangled underbrush that seemed to hum with an ancient energy. For most, it was a place of serene beauty, but for a group of 6 friends on a weekend camping trip, it would become their worst nightmare. The group arrived in high spirits. Ellie, the adventurous one, had planned the trip, promising her friends an escape from their daily grind. The campsite was picturesque, nestled beside a babbling creek with the perfect mix of sunlight and shade. As they pitched their tents and built a fire, the forest seemed inviting, even friendly. By dusk, laughter filled the air as they shared ghost stories and roasted marshmallows. The idea of something sinister lurking in the woods was nothing more than a playful tease. That was until Ellie suggested an evening hike. "Let's explore a bit before it gets too dark," she said, her flashlight already in hand. The others hesitated but eventually gave in, grabbing their lights and following her lead. They wandered deeper into the forest, the trees growing denser, their towering forms blocking out the moonlight. The group was about to turn back when they stumbled upon something that made them stop in their tracks. It was a clearing, unlike anything they had seen before. The air was unnervingly still, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. In the center stood dozens of crude wooden effigies, each about 4 feet tall. They were twisted humanoid forms, carved from branches and tied together with rope. Some had hollowed-out eyes, others outstretched arms that seemed to reach for something unseen. "What the hell is this?" Mark muttered, his voice shaky. "It's probably some kind of art project," Ellie offered, though her voice lacked confidence. Sarah, clutching her boyfriend Jake's arm, whispered, "We shouldn't be here." The group lingered only a moment longer before retreating to camp, their unease growing with each step. Back at the site, they tried to laugh it off, chalking it up to the strange creativity of some eccentric local. But the laughter didn't last long. That night, the forest came alive. Twigs snapped in the distance. The soft rustling of leaves circled the camp. Ellie, unable to sleep, sat up and stared into the darkness. Her flashlight caught movement, a fleeting shadow that darted between the trees. "Did anyone else see that?" she whispered, shaking Mark awake. "See what?" he grumbled, rubbing his eyes. Before Ellie could answer, a loud crack echoed through the woods, followed by a sound that made their blood run cold, a low, guttural growl. The group huddled together in their tents, their flashlights sweeping across the trees. Shapes moved just beyond the reach of the beams, figures that seemed to blend into the shadows. The noises grew louder, footsteps, snapping branches, whispers carried on the wind. Morning brought a brief sense of relief. The sunlight chased away the shadows, and the forest seemed ordinary once again. They tried to brush off the events of the night, dismissing them as overactive imaginations and nocturnal animals. But then Ellie called out, her voice trembling. "Guys, come look at this." She was standing at the edge of the clearing, pointing to the ground. Another effigy had appeared overnight, but this one was different. It was unmistakably modeled after Jake. His broad shoulders, his favorite hoodie, even the scar on his cheek. "This isn't possible," Jake stammered, stepping back. "We're leaving," Sarah said firmly, her voice quivering. As they packed their things, the forest seemed to close in on them. The air grew heavy, and an unnatural silence settled over the area. When they began their hike back to the car, it felt as though the woods were watching them. Every so often, they'd catch glimpses of movement, branches swaying without wind, shadows flitting between trees. By the time they reached the car, their nerves were frayed, and their relief was palpable. But their relief was short-lived. As Jake unlocked the car, he froze, his face pale. Carved into the trunk was another effigy, crudely etched into the metal. Beneath it were the words, You cannot leave." Terrified, they piled into the car, speeding down the dirt road. The forest seemed endless, the trees growing denser the farther they drove. Hours passed, and they realized they were hopelessly lost. When they finally stopped, the realization hit them like a punch to the gut. They were back at the clearing. The effigies were now arranged in a circle, and one more had been added. This one bore a striking resemblance to Ellie, her flashlight clutched in its wooden hand. "Stay together," Mark whispered, though his voice betrayed his fear. But the watchers didn't wait for nightfall this time. They emerged from the shadows, tall, twisted figures with glowing eyes that pierced the daylight. Their limbs moved unnaturally, and their presence was suffocating. The group's screams echoed through the trees, swallowed by the unending darkness. By morning, the clearing stood silent once more, its effigies standing sentinel. No trace of the campers remained, but if one looked closely, they might notice 6 new figures among the wooden sculptures, their carved expressions frozen in terror. The forest waited patiently for its next visitors. The lake was breathtaking, surrounded by dense pines and kissed by the glow of the setting sun. It was a postcard-perfect escape, exactly what Kara, Liam, Rachel, and Ben had hoped for when they booked the lakeside cabin. The air was crisp, the water mirrored the sky, and their laughter echoed across the serene surface. The caretaker, a wiry old man named Mr. Gresham, handed over the keys with a warning. "Stay out of the lake after dark," he said, his voice gravelly and low. "Why?" Kara asked, half laughing at his grave expression. "Things happen in the dark," he replied cryptically, before turning and shuffling away. The friends exchanged uneasy glances, but the warning quickly faded into the background as they settled in, unpacking beers and lighting the grill. As night fell, the lake transformed. Its surface turned inky black, and the surrounding woods seemed to close in. An unnatural stillness replaced the day's lively sounds, but the group, emboldened by drinks and dares, dismissed the unease. "Let's go for a swim," Liam suggested, pulling off his shirt. "But what about the warning?" Rachel asked, hesitating at the edge of the dock. "Old man Gresham's just trying to scare us," Liam said, diving into the water with a splash. The others followed, their laughter masking the chill that seemed to creep through the night air. The water was colder than expected, biting at their skin even in the shallows. Kara, the last to jump in, froze when she felt something brush against her leg. "Ben, was that you?" she called, her voice trembling. "Nope," Ben replied, grinning as he swam further out. But then Rachel screamed. "What is it?" Liam yelled, turning toward her. "Something grabbed me," Rachel gasped, clawing her way toward the dock. "Probably a fish," Liam said, though his bravado faltered when he too felt a cold, unnatural grip around his ankle. He kicked free and swam back to the dock, his breath shallow. Kara and Ben were still in the water when they both felt it, icy, skeletal hands pulling at their legs. Ben was yanked under first, his scream muffled by the water. Kara dove after him, but the lake's depths were impossibly dark. She surfaced, gasping and crying out for help, as Liam and Rachel pulled her onto the dock. "Where's Ben?" Rachel sobbed. He's gone," Kara choked out, staring at the rippling water. The group stumbled back to the cabin, locking the doors and turning on every light. They huddled together, trembling as they tried to rationalize what had happened. "That lake's not normal," Kara said, her voice shaky. "Something's in there." In the morning, they searched for Ben, but there was no sign of him. The lake was calm, its surface betraying no hint of the horrors beneath. Desperate for answers, they returned to Mr. Gresham. "You didn't listen," he said, shaking his head. "The lake doesn't forget. Years ago, a group of townsfolk sank a boat full of outcasts, people they blamed for a string of misfortunes. The lake claimed them, but their souls didn't rest. Now they take anyone foolish enough to swim after dark." The friends stared at him, horrified. "There must be a way to get him back," Kara pleaded. Mr. Gresham hesitated. "You'd have to face them. But no one who's gone into the lake has ever come back." That night, against Rachel and Liam's protests, Kara returned to the dock. Armed with a waterproof flashlight and a rope tied around her waist, she plunged into the lake. The cold was immediate, numbing her limbs as she descended. The beam of her flashlight barely cut through the murk, revealing only brief flashes of the lake bed. Then she saw them, figures floating in the water, their eyes glowing faintly. One of them reached out, its hand brushing hers. She recognized Ben's face, pale and distorted. "Ben!" she screamed, but his lips didn't move. Instead, a voice echoed in her mind. "Leave, or stay forever." The other figures began to stir, their movements sluggish but deliberate. They reached for her, their icy hands dragging her deeper. Panic surged through Kara as she struggled against their grip, the rope around her waist pulling taut as Liam and Rachel hauled her back to the surface. She burst from the water, gasping and sobbing as they dragged her onto the dock. "What happened?" Liam demanded. "They're trapped," Kara cried. "They want revenge." The group left the lake the next morning, their getaway turned nightmare. They never spoke of what happened, but every year, on the anniversary of that night, they heard whispers in their dreams, calling them back to the lake. And the lake waited, its dark waters hiding the vengeful souls beneath, hungry for the next unwary visitor.